It is a historical day in lots of respects, but in our own small, lowercase sort of way. Since it's our first day with no disposables at our events, I'm glad all of you have brought your own. It's also historical. I think this is the third or fourth time we've had the good fortune of being able to host Alain Schnapp here. Alain, you can read from the biography that's online, is retired from being the professor of archaeology at Pantheon-Sorbonne. His work as an archaeologist has been on ancient Greece. He trained with Vidal-Naquet. In fact, as a side point, his first published book was with Vidal-Naquet on the student rebellion in 1968 in Paris. But he's probably better known here, anyway, for his 1994 La Conquête du Passé, and then translated in 1996, The Discovery of the Past, which is really the history of archaeology as written not just from within by an archaeologist, but also in the very broad view of what the history of archaeology is. Actually, not reading the past of the discipline back from the present, but actually finding a way to reimagine what the present of archaeology should be by starting in a past before there was the thing that we call archaeology today. For the past 10, 15 years, he has been involved in an encyclopedic project on ruins, global ruins, the study of ruins, the sentiment of ruins, the integration of artistic experience of ruins, and the learned study of ruins all across the world in different intellectual and cultural traditions. And so it's a great pleasure not only to be able to say, which I've just learned that the book is done and off with the publisher, but also to hear a little bit about it from him here today. Welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. I am so glad to be here. And as I had the fortune to finish the book, this book of the ruins, which seemed a kind of impossible task, I am glad to look at that from the point of view of the book being published in the coming months, and reflecting about the relationship between the program of comparative history of ruins and the effective capacity which is available for a person not able to read all the language of the world to write such a history. Some of my teachers at university, like Georges Dumézil, were people able to read 80 or 100 languages. I have to confess that I never dreamed of such a capacity. If you read Dumézil's works, you see that when he is quoting Hebrew, when he is quoting Chinese, he had his own approach to these languages. It was that's the case of my book of my approach for that. I strongly depend from the learning of my colleagues and the people willing to help me to collect poetry about the past. Because ruins, the way I am looking at the ruins, are not determined by the materiality of objects, by the materiality of the monument, but by the position that these fragments of the past occupy in the meaning of each civilization. So my book my presentation will not cover the large dimension of society without writing. It is not because ruins were not used, is not a concept in non-writing society, but because we do not have the relation and the textuality which give us the possibility to reconstruct that. But look at the Aztec, the excavation as a Pantheon-Sorbonne, you will see all the people, the Aztec of the 15th century, reusing a large example of materials coming from the 12th or the 10th century, and creating an extraordinary structure of spolia. But unfortunately, we can read some of the Mayan hieroglyph or Aztec hieroglyph, but we have not access to this sensibility. And this is the same also for the Vedic and the old Indian tradition, in which I look desperately to find some poetry about ruins in Vedic or Brahmanic society. And it's almost impossible to find a single poem. I found one in Sumatra, but in a context which is not exactly the Vedic, Brahmanic. So I have to apologize, saying that speaking about a comparative history of ruin, I will not consider some society because the access to the reconstruction of the meaning of such society about ruins is a very difficult problem. The second point I wish to stress is that the comparative approach is related to the dialectic between monumentality and non-monument and poetry. And in some culture, use monument as a reminder of the past. And the Western society clearly use that, but even in society using this concept of materiality, you have people trying to connect the past not with the object, but with the poetry or with the language. And you have the Pindar poetry, which is comparing the poem with the facade of a Greek temple, is probably one of the most effective reflection on the competition between words and stones. And clearly, any specialist or any humanist is interested in Horatius' exegi monumentum aere perennius, because we are educated in this idea of this competition. But I was very puzzled when I discovered in Jan Hassman's work that this theme was one of the themes of the Egyptian poetry of the 13th century BC. So the space of comparative history of ruin is a very large one and in some way difficult to rationalize and to organize. So I tried to make a resume, beginning with the visualization of the past, going after to the Chinese or the Japanese example, to the Islamic, and turning back after this comparative journey to the Renaissance and Enlightenment vision. I discovered here, working for the wonderful journal of the Bard College, this extraordinary Vatican casket, which is the oldest portable museum in the sense of Christophe Pomian's semiophore, in which some pilgrim collected objects, and you see all the inscriptions saying this is coming from the tomb of the Christ, this is coming from the Golgotha, this is coming from the mosque. So this is an object which in his materiality do express the symbolic of the pilgrimage and the relationship between the travel of the pilgrim and his representation of the past. This is one of the few extraordinary collection which I was able to discover. In other context, in the medieval Europe, ruins were connected with the fall of the big cities of the past, from Babylon to Rome. And you see this kind of construction of the image in which the process of unification is a process of disintegration. And the Apocalypse in the Morgan Library, for example, give us, you know, the tête bêche construction in which you have the kind of action which is called rovesciamento in the cultural Italian tradition, it's like a process which destroyed radically any kind of ruins. But in his manuscript from the 12th century, you have one of the most extraordinary iconographical construction of the relationship between the church and the synagogue. You see left the synagogue, which the saint is destroying, block stone after stone, and here you have the church which will be reconstructed and created through the destruction of the synagogue. So this is one of the most efficient image of the relationship between word and stones that you can find in Western imagery. Another point of interest is the way in which medieval people looked at the past. This Orkney Bronze Age grave was discovered around the 11th century by a group of Vikings coming back from Rome. And they entered in the Bronze Age grave and they left inscription, more than 21 inscriptions about this discovery. I have no time to discuss this inscription, but the central point was, I discovered the treasury, and I am so-and-so, and after another Viking will come and say, I discovered the treasury, this man is wrong, and another will come and say, no, I was the real discoverer, because in the Viking and Icelandic tradition, a tumulus is a repository of the past, and the relationship between the treasury and the past is a kind of intellectual construction. A little later, Salvatore Setis devoted a wonderful reflection about this image of the Pope Sylvester and the Emperor Constantine discovering the past on the Roman Forum. And you see the first image in which you see the destruction of the Forum, all the ruins of the ancient, and on this white color, and on the second level, you see the new Rome of the 13th century colored. But one of the important things is the way in which the Pope extract all these objects. And you see the dragon here, and the Pope closing the mouth of the dragon in order to avoid the exhalation of the pestilence of the paganism. And you see all these two people who are lying there, they are non-Christian people trying to find the treasury, and the Pope, with the help of God, being able to resuscitate these people. So you see the dramaturgy of the past, of the excavation, of the vision of the paganism, which can be connected also with the Casa of the Crescenzi, which is the spoliarum, because all the house is constructed from spolia. And not only we have the materiality of the past integrated in this house, but we have the dedication, you see the inscription, and the meaning of this inscription, non fuit ignarius cuius domus, ec Nicolos quam nil momenti sibi mundi gloria sentit, verum quod fecit anc noctam vana coegit gloria, cum Rome veterem renovare decorem. His object is to reconstruct the past and to give a revival to the Roman past. But you have some extraordinary reflection which connect the use of ruin with politics in the second part. In domibus pulchris memore, estote sepulchris, confisique tu non ibi stare, dium mors veitur penis, nulla sua vita perennis mansio nostra brevis cursus, et ipse levis si fugas, ventum si claudas ostia centum, lis gormile iubes, non sine morte cubes, si manea castris ferme vitinum, et astris ocius. So the idea that you cannot avoid the death, and reflecting about the past, on creating such a wonderful house, this is the end, erexit patrum decus sobre novare suorum stat patris crescens, matrisque Theodora nomen, occulmen clarum caro propinere gestum Davidi tribut qui pater exhibuit. So this is a token of his faith in his ancestor and of the renovation of Rome. But look at the reflection about the fact, how can you avoid the death? You can try to create a palace with hundreds of rooms and probably thinking that the death will not find you. And this is, for me, a clear allusion to the fact that in some culture, dissimulation is part of the agenda of power. And look at the death of Stalin. Stalin had in the palace at the Kremlin more than 20 different rooms, and he would use a different room each day. But at some moment, as you know, he went sick, and it caused the Khrushchev described that we were waiting, and after only 2 days, he decided to enter and to find Stalin more or less dead. So I use this image in order to explain the connection between the representation of the past, the control of the present, or the dialectic between the death and ruins has a kind of memento mori, which is most of. I wasn't able to write a good English translation of that, but I hope that the Latin was accessible. So, some monuments were accepted as Roman monument, but what to do with monument coming from other tradition? Here you have the first representation of Stonehenge. If you know Stonehenge, you see that it is not very realistic. But the text is explaining that all these stones were created by Merlin as a magician able to block the army coming to invade Brittany. So the figure can be of the past can be mythological, or the figure of the past can be archaeological. Look at that. You have the Chronique du Hainaut of the beginning of the 16th century in the manuscript. This is one of the very few real ruins depicted in a completely different way in medieval iconography. I presented you this 13th or 12th century image, del rovesciamento, but here you feel the technology of the past. Here, the old Roman city in stone, which is described as a medieval castle, on the reconstruction of the city, but not in the technology of stones, but of the technology of material medieval construction. And this is, in my opinion, connected with the vision of the past, embedded in old medieval tradition. And this Barthélemy de Glanville, a monk who devoted, a monk of the 13th century, but the image of the 16th century, who devoted his work to the reconstruction of Aristoteles, he is presenting the birth of species, the birth of any kind of animals, and you see sponte nascitur olle. You see the vases coming directly from the soil. So the vases, which are considered objects of the past, are depicted as a natural object, streaming from like the animals in the process of the creation. And in Hector Mühlich's Chronic of Augsburg, which is the oldest historical account of the beginning of a city, you see the Weser, which of the first place, you see the old population living as a barbaric life of the German oldest tribes. On the second plan, like in the Chronique du Hainaut, the Roman constructing the city of Augsburg, the Roman city of Augsburg. But again, the city is not constructed like a Roman fort or like a Roman construction, but like a medieval structure of the 15th century. And this is another vision which is more interested for an archaeologist because you see these extraordinary grotta of the first plan. These are the kind of terpen, the kind of housing you find between the Fries and Germany at this time. And this is the first documented excavation I was able to find in a manuscript of the beginning of the 16th century. You see this small place which is in its natural state, and after the process of the excavation and the discovery of Roman antiquities, which are connected. So this is, very generally speaking, the vision of the West. What about the vision of the Chinese or the Japanese? One of the oldest description I know from archaeological and antiquarian research in China are these image of the 2nd century, in which you see the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who stay on the top, looking on the river and trying to extract from the river one of the first tripod of the first archaic ruler of China. And Wu Hong, professor in Chicago, one of the people more interested in the reflection about ruins in China, explained in his thesis that in some way the Chinese were not interested in monument, but they were relying for the contact with the past with this tripod, with the bronze object, which were part of the vocabulary of the past. And you have here, between these two vases, you have 2,000 years, but the form is respected. And you have clearly this interest produced during the Song all these catalogues which are part of Chinese antiquarianism. Here you have some imitation of the vases in bronze and in porcelain. But Wu Hong insisted about another dimension of Chinese antiquarianism, on the vision of the ruins. In the Chinese art, you never have a single figuration of ruins. So ruins is a sense of a monument which is in a process of ruination. Monuments are intact, but the environmental array, the trees and other figures are lost, are in some way expressing the dead tree is the expression of the process of unification. You see the stele and the man looking at the stele, and if you go further, the stele is an epigraph. So you read the stele, but you project the poetry you have in your mind in looking at the stele. And you can collect in Chinese art any kind of ruins, but not ruins of monument, but the ruins has passage of time. Here you have the palm considered on the top of this mount. And one of the very few objects which is strongly the depiction of a ruin, which is isolated in Chinese and Japanese art. It is 14th century representation of a Buddhist temple describing the state of ruination of the temple. And you have even at your left a human calvarium, saying so only the Buddhist tradition accept this connection between the reunification of the temple and the passage of time. What about the Islamic vision, or the pre-Islamic vision? In Islamic time, any process of civilization prior to the Islamic revelation was considered Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah means the time of barbarity, the time of ignorant people. So we have the feeling that erudite people in the Islamic world were not interested in the past. But at the contrary, if you look at the monument in Cairo, for example, you have hundreds of examples of people reusing spolia of the Egyptian. You look, these are caravanserai with these inscription, hieroglyphic inscription, or in some way, here you have the facade of a madrasa with the Gothic entrance of a church of Saint Jean d'Acre, of Accra. So you can feel the way in which Egyptian or Persian people could look at the past. At Pasargadae in Iran, you have the tomb of Cyrus, so the Achaemenid ruler, which is connected with Sasanian and Persian tradition, and this inscription is the inscription of a ruler of the 11th, 12th century, Said Ben Zanghi, who developed in both in Arabic and Persian his connection with the monument. The first inscription is in Arabic, saying the victorious, the warrior of faith, Sultan Saad Ben Zanghi, who offers triumph to the prince of believers, may his power last Ramadan of year 6612. And the second, in Persian, says, the warrior of Islam and Muslims, hero of the sovereign empire of Iran and Marquis of Turan, ruler of the horizon, just of the world, heir of the realm of Solomon. So the construction of historiographic vision of the past is related to the idea of the realm of Solomon. These are Achaemenid ruins, but the decipherment of the Achaemenid ruins is the connection with the Jewish Solomon tradition. And you have a mihrab of the tomb of Cyrus, and other object that we could discuss if you wish in a few minutes, but I wish to introduce you to the Western Renaissance, and after we could begin if you wish the discussion. So when we look at the medieval vision of the past, at the Chinese and Islamic vision of the past, we look at society in which the materiality of the past is connected with some inscription, with some vases, with some monument. But the Western vision do enlarge the consideration of the past, connecting it with the collection and the historical reconstruction of the object. And this is one of the books of illustrated books of the 16th century by a Hungarian scholar, Sambucus, Jean Bosch, who was a pupil of Guillaume Budet. And you see at the end, this is one of the few figures of excavation I was able to find at the beginning of the 16th century in the printing iconographical tradition of the West. But at the end, he will say that if you look correctly at the past, you will find object able to offer you issue about the past, which are not available through the written tradition. So this is the affirmation of the transitivity of object in vehiculing the image of the past. And the Olus Magnus Historia, which is the first book dedicated to the antiquity of the North, is presenting us the same kind of reflection. So Olus Magnus was the Archbishop of Uppsala. He had to leave to Luther, to the Reformation, to Rome, and he wrote this book, was the first book dedicated to the antiquity, to the materiality of the past in Scandinavia. But you see the way in which the megaliths of the North are represented as pyramids. So again, this kind of typology, which is more interesting in this figure, because you have the representation of a pagan temple burning, and here the inscription in runic says Antiquitates Servandi. So people use the runic inscription to pass a message of protection of the past in Latin. And you can look on these objects, which are also using in a completely different way in the British Enlightenment, when for the first time people who try to describe megaliths as constructed objects of the past. And this is the time in which Basilus Hammerbach in Basel organized the first excavation, the first public excavation. Because the excavation is paid by the city of Basel. And you can look at these wonderful drawings which are illustrating the different moments of the excavation. And I have no time to discuss this extraordinary painting from Postumus, which was rediscovered very recently. But this is a kind, again, of spoliarum. So any kind of antiquity available in the landscape of Rome is presented as a kind of potpourri which represent any dimension not only of the past, but of the activity of people involved in drawing or interpreting the past. You see all these small personages, they are all people designing with the compass, with writing and reflecting about the past. So this is the act of vision, which find in the Danish-German tradition a kind of extraordinary figure. As on the site of Jelling. Jelling is the site in which the first king, Christian is the kings of Denmark, were present. And Heinrich Rantzau, who was the governor of Holstein at the end of the 16th century, decided to pay for the recognition of the antiquarian landscape at this time, and for the first time he proposed an equivalence between Roman inscription and runic inscription, giving the original runic character and the Latin translation. And one of the extraordinary dimension of Rantzau ruins observation is the connection with the passage of time, because he erected a pyramid in honor of his excavation. And the pyramid was connected with the Principium Mundi, with the Deo Neonato, and with the Christo Deo Nato, and you see, Anato Mahometa. So the idea that the compute of Islamic chronology was part of a vision of the ruins is the opening of a new period in Western vision of the ruins. Michele Mercati, who was a Pope, medics and astronomer, was one of the first to collect the Seronia, or the stone implement. And he tended to discuss the idea of the thunderstones. This is one of the few figures of the creation of thunderstones. But at the same time, people will try to refute that, and if you look at the vision of the past, which is represented in Maximilian of Austria triumphal arch, which was one of the great achievements of the 16th century, and if you connect that with further cabinet de curiosity, Wunderkammer, you see that you run from a display of rare object to a display of the relationship between nature of culture, which is part of the new agenda of Western antiquarianism, and that Robert Hooke expressed in his extraordinary way, trying to reuse antiquarianism to write a new history of nature. Shells and fossils were the medals, urns, or monuments of nature, the greatest and most lasting monuments of antiquity, which in all probability will far antedate all the most ancient monuments of the world, even the very pyramid, obelisk, mummy, hieroglyphs, and coins, and will afford more information in natural history than the other part altogether will in civil. And this is the beginning of Enlightenment natural science. I will stay there and would be glad to hear your comment, question, reflection.
Thank you very much. So that was a lot packed into a short time, and the floor is now open to questions. Well, I'd like to get started just by asking you, because of the way you pulled this together, and also because of the periodization, inevitably, how do you think about the different kinds of knowledge that the more poetic encounter and the more, let's say, scientific study give us? Were people in the pre-excavating world understanding the past in a similar way, or in fact the method of cognition brings with it a different kind of outcome as well?
I think the way of approaching the past and the using of excavation, of certain kind of excavation, has some consequences in the reconstruction of the past. But what struck me is the relationship between all these people interested in the reconstruction of the past and the poetic. And if you look at the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, all the people involved in creating a connection between the materiality of the past, so looking at the soil, excavating or describing antiques, the major writer were the founder of the modern European languages. It begins with Joachim du Bellay in France, creating modern French poetry. It goes to Martin Opitz in Germany, creating modern German poetry. And you find it also in Thomas Browne, writing his Religio Medici, and one of the most most advanced natural scientists in Brittany in the 17th century. So I will say you have a pre-Renaissance working on the past, which is more or less the kind of collecting which is connected with the Mesopotamian, the classical tradition. And a new vision of the past, which is slowly growing in the first half of the 16th century, trying to assume a contact between the modernity of Europe, or the modernity of the world, and the past, and reusing techniques which were part of the agenda of the first Enlightenment excavators, but in order to create a new cultural relationship between the world of modernity and the words of modernity.
You looked at three different cultures, very broadly defined, of using texts and ruins as different, not using, but understanding texts and ruins as different, shall I call them, modes of memory or technologies of memory. Could you say maybe more on, I think I'm aware of the Western tradition and the competition between words and things, and how maybe ruins were conceived to be able to do something in terms of memory works that texts couldn't do. But could you say more on the Chinese and the Islamic tradition, whether there was a clear understanding that was maybe not theorized, but brought out clearly that the ruins can evoke or do memory work in ways that the texts cannot do?
So this is part of the Chinese tradition. From the 5th century, it was the first excavation report from some people working on the Great Wall, and saying we were able to work to discover an ancient tomb, and the tomb was not inscribed. So we could not reconstruct the proper moment of the existence of these people. In order to do that, we have to consider the technology of production. So the coins which were founded, the way in which people created the protocol of animation, and in this exercise, we have to ask a poet to write a poem about the discovery. So you have this is the oldest archaeological excavation I could find in Chinese, the account of that. Previous excavation were very well known, but this Xi-Willian text of the 5th century says, I was working with this worker, I found that. Arriving at the end, saying I cannot reconstruct exactly the period because I cannot find any inscription. But I can perform a sacrifice and write a poem, and in this way I pay my due to the past. And this is part of the Chinese agenda until the Song. At the Song period, we have the first, for me, Zhao Mingsheng, one of the most extraordinary collector of the 11th century, and Yu Shengpao, his wife. This is the first moment in which in Chinese history, in oral history, you find a woman explaining the role of the past and writing a book to the dispersion, to the disintegration of the collection that she and her man had putting down. And this is a process of desacralization, but a very Benjaminian way of looking at materiality and the dialectic of the collection and destruction of the collection. So you could see that the Song period, and I think in the book that Peter published some years ago about Chinese and Western antiquarianism, he described the Song period as a kind of Zeit der Vernunft, the moment in which a kind of rational vision of the past was, and a theory of the knowledge of the past was elaborated. And this is one of the main achievements of Chinese antiquarianism. Islamic antiquarianism, the Islamic vision of the ruins is different because you have in some way the heritage of the Sassanid, of the Greek and Roman, of the Egyptian, of the Mesopotamian. And this is part of the agenda of some historians of the 12th, 13th and 14th century, Egypt or Persia. But this, the way in which Islamic thinkers approach the past is much more poetic than the Chinese. We are not having, like the Chinese, the possibility of using epigraphy.
Yes.
They are in some way pushed to invent new figure. So you can, they are looking at the tomb of Cyrus. They have no idea about Cyrus. So Cyrus is constructed like Solomon, a big king from the past. And so the poetic is a way of offering a theory, an approach of ruins which could not be developed with only rational description of the monument.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question and an anecdote, a comment that are kind of united by kind of the theme of the value of the past. One of the things I took out of your talk was a kind of shift in the value that the past provides in the present. And I was struck by some of the earliest images you showed, juxtaposing present construction with past ruination, and the sense that those realization of and visualization of the ruination gives us in the present, or gives them in their present, a kind of sense of progress, right? It gives a kind of temporal marker for progress. Do you? And my question about this line of thinking is: do we have to flash forward from where you ended the talk to a more modern period before the value of the past in showing progress flips to a kind of nostalgic longing for the past, in which we have not necessarily progressed but regressed or digressed, that it becomes the sense of development switches? Is that only more modern, or does that show up in these other places too?
Part of the agenda of the medieval thinker of the 14th, 16th century. You have the Qasida, the Arabic tradition of recreating the past, and you have a wonderful the odes to the city, the odes to Cordova, the odes to the fall of Nineveh, of Baghdad. So, and you have even these echoes in Hebrew poetry from the Al-Andalus. And there you have a kind of competition between Arabic poetry, about the destruction of the big cities, and Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry will reused in Hebrew framing exactly the same pattern of the Arabic Qasida. In the Chinese world, from the song, in some way, poetry and ruin observation are strongly connected. And if you are an educated magistrate, an educated high officer, you have to be connected with the past. And this is also connected with the Chinese invented the catalogs. So we have catalogs of these vases of the 11th century. You have to wait to the Renaissance in Europe to have catalogs in this sense. They invented also the geographical commented map, in which any structure in a part of the country is described in its also historiographical setting. On this debauch of erudition came to such a level that we have a text from an inspector, a high inspector of administration of the Chinese Empire, saying we have to control these antiquarians, because they are devoting too much time to the past instead of being willing to describe the natural production of the country. So these feelings, which are considered Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment feeling in the West, were shared by very different antiquarians in China or in the culture of Islam from the 10th to the 15th century.
Interesting. Mine, just very briefly, the anecdote really started formulating itself in my mind when you started by talking about the limits of the comparative project and the limits of the literate traditions to get access to these kinds of mediations that you've been talking about, visual or textual. And I was thinking about a case that I know of among the Inuit in the north, 20th century Inuit, who occasionally find ancient stone or more often ivory pieces, thousands of years old, that the permafrost preserves and then pushes up. And in some cases, people, when they have found these, they've very quickly sold them to collectors, which we might think of as peculiar, that they're not held up as heritage on the one hand, or subject to contemplation for just the kinds of reasons we're talking about. And the discourse that's often used in those moments is that these objects from the past were left there, planted there even, by ancestors to be resources in the present for contemporary needs. And for me, that speaks to a very different kind of temporality, but also a very different sense of what the value of the past and the present might be, rather than for contemplation and historical consciousness, but for use, economic, very kind of economic use in the present. And it's interesting to me that, in a kind of animistic society that imagines the ancestors being present in daily life in all sorts of ways, the past doesn't need to offer itself up for historical consciousness in the same way.
The face value of the treasury of the past are part of a continuous story of antiquarian history, beginning with all the chasseurs de trésors in the old empire in Egyptian tradition. And one of the problems of the pharaoh is to prevent this kind of aggression. But you have a wonderful film by an Egyptian dramatist dedicated to the discovery of the 25th dynasty and the way in which the local people do look at the past as an economic resource. So people know in some part in Egypt, but also in Pakistan, people know very well where are the necropolis. And local community will control the extraction of this object in order to ensure some economic benefit to the community. And you find that also, you spoke about the Inuit, and I have the feeling that the Inuit look at that is more or less the same like the Viking. Because for the Viking, the face value of the treasury is much more important than the historical and poetical background. You find that in a lot of saga in which a man is becoming very rich because he has to discover some objects, and this hunt for the treasury is part of the social policy.
Thank you.
Does that, sorry,
No,
please.
go ahead.
No.
I have a question. You mentioned in several cases where you use the word the past and the ruins interchangeably. I'm just wondering, especially from the context of Chinese and Japanese history, do you think these two words mean the same because you do use them interchangeably? And also, the reason why I'm asking because in Wu Hong's book, he talked about the ruin in Chinese culture, since, as you mentioned, like through the medium of writing poems, and then they don't really depict ruins in paintings, but they will just illustrate these kind of trees that are old and steles. But he didn't really mention the tradition of collecting start to appear in the Song dynasty, which was a very important part. It's a part of the antiquarianism. But he didn't mention that as a part of the culture of appreciating ruins or having that kind of sense of nostalgia. So I'm wondering whether you think these two are the same, or if they're different, how different?
No, you have certainly different behavior to the relationship with the past. So one of the most striking dimensions is all these poetics of ruins that you find in classical Chinese writer from the 5th century. And you can compare, you have the poem of Dunong, which is describing the city crawling and inhabited by the animals. And you can connect that with Latin and Greek poetry of the 5th century BC. So you see the way in which in antiquarianism and poetics of the past are part of the Chinese agenda. In the Japanese vision, these are slightly different, because for the Japanese, the most important thing is the capacity of reconstruction. And this is connected with the idea of the Shikinen Shengu, so the ritual which consent to reconstruct the famous sanctuary of Ise each 20 years after the erection of the first sanctuary. And this, I had the privilege to assist to the last ceremony in the sanctuary of Ise, which is maintained from the 8th century to the present. So, and this is a kind of relationship between permanency and impermanency, which is much more developed in Japanese society than in Chinese society. So this, I don't know if I was able to respond to all your very right questions, but I have the feeling that if we follow Quan Shishang, Yale professor, and Wu Hong, we can reconstruct from the text and the description of antiquarianism and ideology of ruins in ancient Chinese society, that the consideration of the past is a major cultural and political investment. But if you are able to collect, if you are to interpret the past, you can be, the emperor can be a good emperor, and the high priest can be a good priest, and so on. So this distinction of knowing, embellishing, interpreting the past is a very exclusive weapon of distinction, in the sense of the art of distinction that you find in 16th, 17th century Europe and in Peresque and other antiquarians of the time.
So you're looking at the history, this kind of cross-cultural history of the appreciation of the past and ruins in a way which is essentially secular, right? You're seeing it as part of, in a sense, the roots of a more scientific form of archaeology, of antiquarian scholarship in the 19th and 20th centuries. But one aspect of it, it seems to me the main, and this is going to sound very kind of general, but part of the reason that people were interested in the past is because it's about their religious concern about the afterlife. I mean, there's the profound realization that human life is finite, but things survive longer than humans, and that's something probably, to go back to prehistory, is that this fascination with the survival of objects as opposed to the persistence of human consciousness. So, and that seems to me very religious in root, not secular at all. So in all these different cultures, I mean, isn't it still very much tied to religion?
Clearly, the basic vocabulary and the structure of meaning is religious. We find that even in the Greco-Roman world. That piety of the past is in order to accept the succession of generation, and you have that magnificently present in Egyptian poetry of the 12th, 11th, and 10th century BC, in which Jan Assmann wrote a wonderful essay on that, in which the fact that you are able to interpret the past clearly describe you as a pious man. And this is one of the questions when people asked Piccolomini why he was pious. And his answer was ego sum pius Aeneas. So I have not the time to insist to the value of religion if in any of this society. Because if you try to construct a comparative approach, you have to, in some way, to respect the religious boundaries of the approach of the past, but you have to insist, as I insist, to the more secular vision, which is not only connected with the piety of the people, but with the social norm, which is connected with this practice. So you have Confucianism opposing to Buddhism, because for the Buddhist, the materiality of the past is very important, because the traces of the Buddha is part of a religious feeling. For the Confucianist, you are not connected with this kind of religious dimension. You are connected with that in the way you are able to respect the past, to interpret it. So this gives you a major intellectual dimension. But the question you raise is clearly present in any moment of this comparative history of ruins. And in fact, in modern, you quoted the Inuit, but if you look at the Amazon Indians, if you look at the Aborigine in Australia, clearly shamanism and the cult of ancestor and the interpretation of ruins are strongly connected. And this explains why the Arnhem people in Australia, which are the people without any construct, so probably the most, one of the few populations in the history who are not living even in cabins, even in huts. And these people had created kinds of object, which can be transferred from one generation to the other, and be a kind of Lévi-Strauss, looking at the history of the Arnhem people, and using anthropological work, say that these objects, the Chulumba, they are the archives of the Arnhem people. This is probably a bit exaggerated, but these objects, which are connected with the dream theory, which is part of the relationship between people and landscape, are, my vision, which is more a comparative sociological inquiry than a reconstruction of any kind of genealogy of the wind, are connected with the past time and the approach of unification.
We're going to have to stop here formally so students can get to class. Those who want to keep asking questions can do so. Thank you very much.